Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Ready, Set, Respond. This is a program where we try to tackle topics that are relevant to our multifamily operations. Now, I'm your host, Carla Alise. I'm the Director of Research and Performance here at Apartment Ratings and Satisfax, and I'm really excited to have today's conversation. We're going to be talking about fee transparency with special guest Jay Harris. Now, Jay Harris is a partner at Hudson Cook. And, he has extensive expertise in property management compliance with deep knowledge of regulatory frameworks that impact our operations, including fair housing, UDAP, which we're going to talk about extensively today, fee disclosures, transparency, all sorts of policies that are really focused on protecting consumers, right? Because renters are consumers too. So, how do we as operators make sure that we continue to meet those ever changing and ever growing expectations of consumers, right? So today's conversation is going to be all about fee transparency. And after the conversation, just like any other program, please head on over to our social page where you can post a comment with your favorite takeaway or aha moment from this conversation for a chance to win a special gift. But as always, I like to start our conversations out with some audience polls. So see that QR code on the screen. Go ahead and scan that and get logged in. That's going to allow you to participate. I have only 2 polls, but I really want to know what your opinions are, what you're experiencing out there, because we're seeing what's happening in the legal circles. We're seeing the regulations and the legislation and some cases that are being brought to multifamily in regards to fee transparency. And I can't wait to bring on Jay to talk more about that. But what are you guys seeing out there in the field? So we're going to start with our first poll. Let me pull that up here. Here we go. In your experience, how transparent do you believe your company or community is about fees being charged beyond the advertised rate? Are you very transparent, somewhat transparent, or not transparent enough? Okay, got some results coming in. Right now, it looks like we've got about 37% very transparent, 37% somewhat, 20% not transparent. Things are starting to change a little bit. We've got very transparent down to 27, somewhat transparent around 58, not transparent enough about 15%. Whatever the numbers end up being, it looks like there is some work that we need to do in order to be very transparent. Right now, we're coming in mostly somewhat transparent. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, let's do our next poll. All right. I want to know from you, what is the most common challenge your teams face when communicating fees to residents? Now, you can select all that apply. Is it a lack of standardized disclosure practices? Is it confusion about mandatory versus optional fees? Is it pushback from residents on reoccurring charges? Or is it coordination between leasing and marketing teams? There we go. We got a lack of standardized disclosure practices. Had a little bit of confusion about mandatory, 20%. Pushback, 33%. Coordination, 16%. 33%, 37%, okay, 44% lack of standardized disclosure practices. Okay, so a little bit of everything. Well, we're going to talk about this with Jay. But before we do, I wanted to share some research we did here at Satisfax. At the end of last year, we published the report in January in our biannual online renter study. Now, over the years, let me frame this a little bit. Over the years, renters have their expectations have been increasing, right? Because they're not just renters. They're doing all sorts of different activities online, shopping online. I mean, you can get a mortgage online. You could buy a car online. So these processes that they're interacting with on a daily basis are shaping their expectations for how transparent we are with them when they come to rent an apartment. And every operator seems to have a different sophistication level with their technology. Some operators still don't even offer online leasing. So how can we be fully transparent with our fees and charges and the structure of those charges when we don't even have those online workflows determined? There's a lot of challenges going on here, and we've seen that increasingly impact consumers, aka renters, expectations and satisfaction. So we added a few questions to the online renter study about that, and we found out that mandatory fees in addition to rent is a hot topic for renters. 81% of renters feel management companies need to be more transparent about mandatory fees. We also asked what information is most important when you're shopping for an apartment. And renters rated that information on mandatory fees beyond the advertised rent as the highest information that is important to them, 4.74 out of 5. So we're not seeing legislation coming at us for no reason. Renters are frustrated. Yes, their expectations have changed, but have we kept up? Let's take a look at this information broken down a little bit now by region, right? So we asked renters, were you informed about the charges and fees associated with your current lease before you signed it? So guys, this is now, they've done their online search, they've done the tour, they've done the application, and they're going to sign their lease. So we have a percentage of renters getting all the way up to that lease signing saying that they were not informed. In some cases, that's 1 in 5 residents. That's a really high percentage. And in worst case scenario, 1 in 3. So there's a situation happening. I think it has to do with our adoption of technology, how our systems talk to one another, but it's becoming more and more imperative that we address these issues. So to help us navigate the legal framework, what do we need to do? Let's bring out our guest. Jay, are you with us?
I am, Carla. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. Jay, thank you so much for joining the conversation today. I do think that this topic is so very poignant and becoming more and more urgent. And some of the information you shared with me, I'm very excited for you to share with our guests. So given all this information, what should our audience know from a regulatory standpoint about maybe, say, the different frameworks, the federal laws, the federal level, and the state and local jurisdictions about fee transparency?
Right. That's a great question, Carla. So I think, traditionally we've looked at landlord-tenant law on market rate properties, market rate rentals, and then if we're involved in certain subsidy programs, also some of the HUD obligations on that. And then, operationally, occasionally federal laws will come into play when it comes to certain corner areas like credit reporting or debt collection or things like this. But we haven't seen a lot of activity until really recently in the last year, where the general federal consumer protection laws are being applied in the rental space. And a key leader in this area is the Federal Trade Commission. They have a broad authority under federal law. It's called the Section 5 authority to prohibit and enforce against unfair and deceptive acts and practices in business. So this is a very broad mandate. It's not specific to rental housing. It applies generally in the commercial space. But what's new is that, as we'll talk about in this recent enforcement action, we've seen that they've defined things like a total monthly leasing price as a new concept as part of a recent settlement from last month. And so that raises some questions for both the advertising presentation of rents and fees, as well as in the lease process, how to describe these accurately at a time when the consumer can review it before they've put down, let's say, a non-refundable deposit or a non-refundable application fee. So that's been one area where they're looking at it, and then similarly, a rulemaking. We'll also talk about where junk fees have been politically kind of an issue that the Biden administration has leaned into in a bunch of areas, airlines, Ticketmaster, things like this. And this junk fee rulemaking, we're waiting to see if a final rule will further define what fee disclosures and all price disclosures need to look like. So we'll talk about both those things.
Okay. So the FTC has raised some serious concerns about transparency under this Section 5, right? Including hidden fees and advertised rates and service representations that just don't match reality. So could you walk us through these allegations and what they could possibly mean in our arena in property management?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it. So this is the first time that the Section 5, the unfair and deceptive acts and practices part of the FTC Act, has been applied in the rental housing space. It's for a specific enforcement matter against a larger single-family rental operator in the settlement from a few weeks ago. And we'll talk a little bit about the allegations, but I think that the one takeaway is in looking at the settlement, it gives us an idea of the concepts and kind of the target, but it's important in that it is not a new rule or a minimum requirement. Although it would not be surprising to see some of the concepts we'll talk about with this total monthly leasing price in a future FTC rule around fee disclosure. So let's talk about the specific single-family rental settlement from a few weeks ago.
Okay.
This is one where the advertised renter rates didn't disclose mandatory fees, and there were certain additional lease requirements where the resident had to pay for a utility management fee, had to pay for the internet package that was offered, and even had to pay for certain smart home services that were part of the package beyond what's in the rent. And these fees were not disclosed until after an application fee or after a unit reservation fee that wasn't refundable was paid. So these were issues both in the advertising process and the leasing process. And there are also some other issues in this case that are kind of beyond the scope of this marketing discussion today about certain quality representations, service quality representations, as well as some traditional property management issues around security deposit management and so forth, beyond our scope today. But what was interesting is it's the broadest application of Section 5 General Federal Consumer Protection Statute to the rental housing space in the market rate area.
Wow.
So that's what they alleged, and I think what's important is to look at the concepts they have in mind in the settlement.
So let's talk about the settlement.
Sure.
Give us the details.
Sure.
What is that total monthly leasing price?
Yeah, the other thing I'd say in context is that at the Federal Trade Commission for the first time, they've announced that they have a renter working group. They are looking at the authority that they have and seeing how it applies in the rental housing space. So I don't think this is going to be the last of what we see. But the one thing that they have come up with, and that was agreed to by the defendant, is that in advertising going forward, in order to settle the case, the right thing to do in the settlement was to publish a total monthly leasing price, which is rent plus all the mandatory fees and charges. And this has to be more prominent than other pricing information. So as you think about it, the rent for this particular unit is the total monthly leasing price, not just the base rent.
Yeah.
And importantly, as you're describing the fee components that go into this, you have to talk about what they represent, whether they're required or not, and then the amount of the fee. And so by disclosing this information with the transaction. Consumer is better informed, is not surprised by hidden fees that come up only after they're well along in the application process.
So, okay, let me share some background about multifamily advertising. We often want to advertise, and everyone has a different philosophy. Different operators do things slightly different. We know that. But it's very common for us to advertise, say, a starting rent. Our rents start at, which typically would be the lowest market rent on the most optimized lease term without any additional mandatory fees added in. So that is typically what we're seeing being fed over to the ILSs, or even when you're on a property website, just on the actual floor plans page, you'll see that starting monthly rent. And then as the consumer digs in more and more, maybe now they're getting into the online application or an offer letter or a quote, then we start to see more of the variations in rent based off of lease term and the additional fees being disclosed. However, a lot of that information isn't, I would say it's not very clear and conspicuous on the websites, and it's definitely not very clear and conspicuous on most internet listing sites. So Jay, would you say that this particular settlement is an indicator that the industry needs to shift from that starting rent as that advertised price to the TMLP, the total monthly leasing price?
Indicator is a good way to put it, Carla. I think you're right. I think it's going to be, again, this is one settlement in one case. We do have states, Minnesota is one that immediately comes to mind, that are ahead of what the feds are doing in that they require that your rent pricing has to be, if you're starting at 800, you got to be able to show that there really are people who are paying 800, and your total all-in pricing with mandatory fees is what you need to be advertising the unit for. So I think if somebody is continuing to say starting at with a base rent, but even that renter is going to be paying some other mandatory fee, you need to roll in the mandatory fee to whatever that starting at number is and advertise that and disclose the reasons for that, the fee components in the advertising and the leasing process. So these are the new concepts, and I think indicator is a good way to put it. It's possible we'll get some more clarity if the Federal Trade Commission were to finalize this rule that we'll talk about next, which is broadly applicable to business. But I think you're right, Carla, that landlords or housing providers have different approaches to how they disclose the prices and products for rent plus the services. And one of the stated purposes of the rulemaking and the enforcement activity is to give a level playing field so that not just consumers, but businesses can benefit from even disclosure of a similar price for a similar description of goods and services.
Absolutely. And when a renter is starting their search online, typically they'll end up on an ILS. And the ILS has some fundamental basic filters that they start their search with: location, bed and bath, and price range. And so it's that price range that consumers are filtering for that they're then shocked about as they get further down the leasing process.
Right.
And so that brings me to the rule, the FTC rule. I guess they had a call for comments.
Yep.
And they had over 60,000 comments. Do you have any idea or understanding of what percentage of those comments came from renters versus, say, operators?
Well, there were about 7 or 8 specific industries that were called out or analyzed in some detail in the rulemaking. Right, the FTC is trying to make the case that this should apply to businesses generally, but they were reflecting the complaints they've heard. And I will tell you, some of the tenant advocate community was pretty active and well organized in calling for the need for this rule, This is where you heard the concept that was in the news about a year ago about this idea of the January fee, where some landlord someplace was charging basically an annual fee, but wasn't able to describe what it was for. It was just, every time a new year would come up, they would check on this additional fee. So, these kinds of examples came out of, consumer friendly examples came out of the comments to the rule initially. And so you're right, 60,000 comments was enough. And, I tell you, somebody who's bought things online, as I'm sure many of us have, and what I got was very different than what was described. And the pricing was a little different than what I thought I was getting going into the transaction. I have some sympathy with some of the comments, particularly, on other products and services for things like ticket fees and hotel surcharges and things like that.
Yeah, concert is a big one too, right?
That's right. So the punchline here is that we don't have a final rule yet. There's not a new minimum standard of performance yet, but there is a lot of activity going on to think about and change how rents and fees are advertised on property websites and how they're advertised on ILSs and other third-party sites. And the concepts that we saw in the single-family rental settlement we were talking about are the same kind of concepts we see here in the proposed rule. So this idea that it's going to be an unfair and deceptive act in practice, that Section 5 concept again, if you're advertising these prices without a total price. So where we had total monthly leasing price in the settlement, here is the total price, and it's the total of all fees that are mandatory, including any required ancillary good or service. And so if you don't advertise that and don't advertise it more prominently than, let's say, the base rent, arguably that's a violation of the law, and not just on the federal law, but also often we see that state attorneys general who have their own UDAP rules, consumer protection rules against unfair and deceptive acts and practices, and even private plaintiffs who can bring suits under certain states' UDAP rules will adapt these concepts in their own enforcement activities. So it's not just, hey, we're waiting to see if the FTC figures out our particular set of properties. The greater concern, and I think the need to move now rather than to wait, is that the theories that are in a final FTC rule can pretty quickly be adopted by local private plaintiffs and local attorneys general. So, again, so we've got this hidden fee concept, disclosing the total price, and then the idea of misleading fees, that these pop up and haven't been represented earlier in the process. And so the idea here that the FTC talks about is that before the consumer is agreeing to pay, the description of the fee, whether it's required, and the amount of the fee need to be disclosed in the transaction.
Yeah.
And then and the final bit I'll put in here is that there's no preemption of the state law either under the initial proposal. So it's possible if you're in, again, go back to Minnesota, which has this obligation already, it's possible that you're complying with this federal law as well as a additional state obligation too.
Yeah. And as you said, the state laws or the local laws can be, even greater and more, I wouldn't say restrictive, but give more detail into what's required, right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing them already popping up. So here we've got
this is a little bit of a
Maine.
Yep, this is a little bit of a eye strain, so I'll keep it at a high level. But some of the concepts we see, I think we'll see more of as we move into 2025 when all the legislatures are in session in the spring. But there are different approaches here to housing providers' fees, right? So Colorado is capping the amount that can be charged where the owner is billed by a third-party vendor. So limiting the amount of markup that the owner can charge. Those of you that are operating in Colorado are familiar with that already. It's relatively rare, but we may see that concept some more as we move into next year. Maine is one where The landlord has to get the tenant's signature on a disclosure of what the total rent cost is, and similarly notice of any, even the optional recurring fees as well as the mandatory fees. Virginia's one similar disclosure concept in the lease. It's got to, if the fee isn't in the lease, and if it's not disclosed on the first page, then you may not be able to charge for it.
Mm.
Minnesota, we talked about a little bit, which applies to both advertising as well as leasing disclosures. The Massachusetts, I think, is one to watch because they actually have their own rule, just like the feds do, requiring the disclosure of clear and accessible information about pricing and making it easier to cancel recurring charges, which is another consumer protection concern. So if you've set up somebody on a recurring charge for a certain service, making sure it's clear to the tenant how they can drop the charge if they no longer need it. Mm-hmm. So these are, this is not exhaustive, but these are some of the concepts that states already have played with when they're looking at this area, and I think we'll see more states following these patterns as we move into 25. The other area here is whether the fee can be charged at all. So far, we've talked about the need to disclose it appropriately, mm-hmm. but there are also in California and Colorado this year some complaints under state law that certain kinds of charges like pest control fees and trash fees and certain billing fees, utility billing fees or invoicing fees, violate the underlying state contract law. And mm-hmm. so there are cases that none of these have moved beyond the complaint stage. So but they're all class action allegations under state law that are saying, for example, if the housing provider has the obligation to deliver a habitable apartment under the law, then the resident should not be paying recurring pest control fee where everybody pays a few dollars a month to provide extermination services. That ought to be the housing provider's responsibility. Mm-hmm. So we mention these because sometimes fees have been challenged in the past, but it does seem like there's more activity by plaintiffs' counsel in this space to challenge the permissibility of these fees. And so we'll keep watching this as these cases go forward to see if a certain fee is maybe called into question, not just for disclosure purposes, but because the judges may find that these violate the landlord's obligation under the real property and contract law of the state.
Absolutely. I was completely unaware of these recent class claims. I find it very interesting, and I will be paying attention for sure. So we've talked about some different types of fees, but you also mentioned that there's more talk about screening or payment fees. So,
yep. So I mean, just briefly on this, I would say these are sort of lower concerns. The application screening fees, several of those are already capped by state law. There haven't been a lot of changes in this area. There have been some little tweaks in the process of how you manage applications in California and when you can't charge a screening fee if there's no available unit and you're actually not going to screen somebody. Things like that under new laws that would take effect in January. But, largely people are familiar with under what circumstances they can charge an application fee.
Yeah.
I think the other area, just briefly, because I know we're running short on time, is this idea that if there's a convenience fee for making a payment, it's a good idea to have that authorized in the rental agreement, in the lease. Mm-hmm. CFPB is taking the position that you can't later authorize the consumer to pay a few dollars for the convenience of paying if it's not authorized in the original lease. Mm-hmm. So kind of corner cases, but ones that have come up with our discussions with our clients here in the last couple months.
Okay, so we've talked about the concept of total monthly price, and that we know there's some cases, we know there's activity happening at the federal level and at the state level. What do operators need to know now? What's the major takeaway for operators to be focused on in the coming year to prepare for any legislation that may affect them?
Yeah, so some of this will depend on the states you operate in. But if I were advising property management company, I would want to make sure that you can deliver on your property website transactional all-in pricing in your advertising and in disclosures that you make before the application fee has to be paid for, so that you're able to describe briefly what the fee is for, and derive then a lease specific monthly price for that unit, for that transaction. And I think some firms are there already. A lot of this depends on how complex the list of vendors are that you're working with and how well you integrate that pricing information already. I think it's a good start to have some of this mandatory fee information, maybe a range in FAQs that are on the property website. But I think we're moving towards an expectation that this will be disclosed on a transactional level so people can compare prices of all-in mandatory prices on a monthly basis. I think the related issue I was just going to say is on the third-party websites. I know there's more activity to get real-time pricing information, real-time fee information, and be able to serve that up in the ILS community.
Yeah.
And I think to some degree that is only as good as the integration capability that the property management firm has into the ILS that it uses. If the property management firm can't present this information transactionally, all in required pricing, the ILS can take most of it, but not all of it. And so I think that's the kind of the wrestling match that's going on right now.
Yeah. There's three components there, right? There's your property management system. Is that being admin so that all of the fees are properly in the right place? Then there's the data feed that shoots out to the ILSs, the information, making sure that information, once it's in the PMS, is also in the data feed. And then if it's in the data feed, making sure that the ILS knows how to receive that information and displays it in the proper way. So it is somewhat complex, but when necessary, I do believe our industry is very capable of resolving fee transparency. I think it's more about just making sure. I think that the counterbalance, the argument that I hear is, well, if I advertise all of my fees as the all-in rent, but all my competitors are not, then it's putting me at a disadvantage and I'm losing leads and it looks like I'm more expensive than my competitors. So
totally agree with that. Yeah, totally agree with that.
I think that's where the industry is right now, right? Yeah. And how do we make sure that we're all playing on an even playing field? So is that what NMHC is working towards, helping with those efforts?
Yeah, they're involved sort of in two ways. One, on the policy side, they're involved in articulating to the Federal Trade Commission and other policymakers what's unique about our industry and the complexity of actually carrying this out and educating the industry about it. But I think, just as important, and they're doing some of this at OpTech, their conference next week, they are convening groups to talk about the exchange of information and to see if there are any data standards or other industry protocols that can help with the free and flow exchange of pricing and fee information among property management software vendors, property management companies, marketing sites, and so forth. And I'm interested to hear what the latest in that area is, because I think those who really dig into this for a while, and especially with larger operations, are wrestling with how do you provide that variety of vendors and real-time pricing in to deliver this at a transactional level. So I applaud NMHC for doing this. And I think you're right. I think there are several businesses that are watching to see if the FTC comes out with a rule where as of a particular date and time, you've got a minimum requirement that you have to meet for disclosing your total pricing information.
Your total pricing.
And maybe we'll see that.
Yeah.
It's possible we would see that in a Harris administration or in a Trump administration, because I think there's a lot of consumer support, Republican, Democrat, consumer, whatever stripe you are, for the idea that there should be a full and fair price disclosure so you can comparison shop with the same concepts from property to property or hotel to hotel or airline to airline.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jay, thanks for joining us today for this very important conversation, laying down the foundation of the legal arguments towards fee transparency. For our audience, if you would like to get in contact with Jay, go ahead and scan this QR code. It'll take you to his LinkedIn profile where you can connect. I've been working with Jay now for a little over a year on transparency with reviews and reputation, moving into now fee transparency. And I think, we're also talking about, consumer protections and, the sharing of our resident data, email addresses, do not resell. I think consumers in general and renters, again, our consumers are really looking for that transparent interaction when they're searching for an apartment. So anything we can do to live up to that expectation, I think will definitely help us from a legal standpoint. So, Jay, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate that.
My pleasure, Carla. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And everyone, don't forget to head on over to Satisfact, share your favorite takeaway with us. And then next month, Ready, Set, Respond, it's going to take a little hiatus because we are having our Epic Week. So look out for those Epic emails in November, from November 18th to 22nd. But we'll be back in December. Can you believe it's already December? And what we're going to do for Ready, Set, Respond in December is we're going to have a Ready, Set, Respond rally. What we're going to do is look back at all the episodes from the last 2 years. We're celebrating our 20th episode. We're going to do a huge quiz, a huge contest where you can compete on a leaderboard for prizes and giveaways. So take a look back on the YouTube channel at some of that content, then get registered and ready to play the Ready, Set, Respond game. Look forward to seeing you guys then. Thank you for your time today. And we'll be back in December. Have a great day.